Well, welcome everyone to this session of Humanist Australia. The title of today's talk and discussion is Freedom of Thought Report, Australia. My name is Les Allen. I sit on the board of Humanist Australia and I'll be your presenter and facilitator today. So what's this session about today? Each year, Humanists International compiles its Freedom of Thought report, examining the systemic and legal discrimination across the globe against humanists, atheists, and the non-religious. After presenting a brief overview of the recently released 2003 report, Les Allen will explore the key findings for Australia. Although Australia has a proud history of separation of church and state, the report highlights some continuing areas of concern with government, education and freedom of expression. Now, participants are encouraged to ask questions and share their views on the report findings. So what's Humanist Australia got to do with Humanist International Freedom of Thought report? Humanist Australia is a member organisation of Humanist International. Together, we advocate for a more tolerant and benevolent society in which all, regardless of their religious belief or non-belief, can reach their full potential. Rewarding and satisfying lives are only achievable when each of us can follow our conscience and our passions, free from bigotry, persecution and discrimination on the basis of belief. For every Freedom of Thought report, Humanist International invites Humanist Australia to assist with providing information about the current situation in Australia. And I notice at the front of the special edition report, there's an acknowledgement of Humanist Australia's contribution to the report, just on the overleaf. Okay, so what am I going to be dealing with tonight? Here's how the talk will be structured. First, I'll be answering the question for you, what is or who is Humanist International? Next, answering what is the Freedom of Thought report? And next, what are the key findings of the 2003 report, which was released just at the end of last year? Next, what does the report say in particular about the situation in Australia? And lastly, with all of that, so what? What does it mean for us as humanists, secularists, atheists? So first, what is or who is Humanist International? Well, the organisation was founded in Amsterdam in 1952. It was called then the International Humanist and Ethical Union, or IHEU. Now, it changed its name in 2019 to the more user-friendly Humanists International, and I see that format is being progressively adopted by all humanist organisations, or more and more humanist organisations around the world, where the name starts with humanists and then the name of the locality, like Humanist Victoria or Humanist Canada or Humanist Australia. Now, Humanist International is the umbrella organisation for more than 160 free thought, atheist, humanist, secularist, ethical organisations in over 80 countries. So it's quite pervasive. It's quite a significant profile for humanists and atheists and secularists. It does maintain a delegation to the United Nations generally, and specifically to the United Nations Human Rights Council and the Council of Europe. Now, here's how Humanists International describe themselves in the Freedom of Thought report itself. Humanist International is the global representative democratic body of the humanist movement, which unites a diversity of humanists and other non-religious organisations and individuals. We want everyone to live a life of dignity in a world where universal human rights are respected and protected, including adherence to political secularism by all states. We work to build, support and represent the global humanist movement by defending human rights, particularly those pertaining to non-religious people, and promoting humanist values worldwide as exemplified in the Amsterdam Declaration 2002. Now, the Amsterdam Declaration is a very, very short declaration of the core of humanist principles. Just look up Amsterdam Declaration on the web and you will quickly get to it. So what's sitting behind the Freedom of Thought report? What's it all about? Well, it's researched and published by Humanist International on an annual basis. And every year they do a detailed update on 10 of the countries that are included in the report. It reports on systemic and legal discrimination against the non-religious, including atheists, agnostics, secularists, humanists, of course. Uh, and it focuses on government and non-government restrictions in these three key areas: restrictions on freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. Secondly, restrictions on freedom of expression. And thirdly, restrictions on freedom of assembly and association. Now, the key countries edition, which I'll be reading excerpts from later, that's a detailed update on 10 of the countries included in the comprehensive report. So those three restrictions that I just pointed to on the last slide, each of those is encapsulated by one of the articles in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the one about freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, that's articulated particularly in Article 18 of the UDHR. And this is where the work of Humanist International ties in very, very directly with these universal principles of universal human rights. So that particular article says everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. Now, the human rights, United Nations Human Rights Council put out a directive a while ago now, just to make clear that when it talks about freedom of religion and belief, it includes freedom of lack of religion and non-belief. Okay, so that's the first article on freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. The second article that taps in directly to the Humanist International Freedom of Thought report is the one focusing on right to freedom of opinion and expression. That's Article 19 in the UDHR, and that one says everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. The last focus for restrictions is taps into Article 19, Article 20 of the UDHR, and that one says everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, and no one may be compelled to belong to an association. So I said I'd give you an overview of the global findings across all of the countries included in the report. Here's a snapshot of the key findings. An overwhelming majority of countries fail to respect the rights of humanists, atheists, and non-religious. Now, the references here are references to the key countries edition, and I'll point you to it when I get to the reference section at the end. I'll show you how you can download it. The next key finding is that in more than 10 countries, apostasy is punishable with death. The third key finding is in many countries, blasphemy laws outlaw criticism of protected religions, religious beliefs, figures, and institutions. Next, some countries even bar atheists from marrying and removing the parental rights of atheists. Next, some countries ban the non-religious people. They bar them from public office, and those countries privilege a particular state religion. Now, Humanist International have what they call a watch list, a list of the 10 most egregious countries that egregiously and severely restrict the rights and freedoms of the non-religious. On the watch list this year are Afghanistan, Greece. I was surprised to see Greece on there. India, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Sri Lanka, Sudan, and Uganda. So I hope that gives you a snapshot of the key points coming out of this year's global report. So in the global report, they've got a number of these maps, like heat maps, color-coded maps, that give you a summary of where the most worrisome countries, or who the most worrisome countries are. This is the overall map for the whole four dimensions that the researchers look at. And what are those four dimensions? For each country, the reporters look at constitution and government. Second one is education and children's rights. Third one is family, community, society, religious courts and tribunals. And the last one is freedom of expression, advocacy of humanist values. Now, in the report, there's a separate color chart for each one of these dimensions. So that what I'm showing you here is the most general color chart that bundles all the four dimensions together. And you can very quickly see where the troublesome areas still are in the world. Quite a number of Southeast Asian countries, USSR, of course. The top part of South America, and the top of Africa and the middle of Africa. We come out as a yellow, which is mostly satisfactory. So not a bad score, but we're not green. It looks like South Africa down there on the Horn of Africa, and the United States and Alaska. I'm surprised that Canada comes out with a worse score than the United States, given its current political situation. Okay, so that's the general lay of the land. Okay, so now let's focus particularly on what the report says about Australia. Overall, it says Australia is doing reasonably well. And here's what the report says is working well in Australia: that we do have constitutional protection of religion and non-religion, and that's particularly protected in section 116. About the separation of church and state. The Commonwealth shall make no law establishing a religion, something like that, the Establishment Clause. The second thing that's working well is that there are federal laws that protect freedom of religion and belief, and to some extent lack of freedom and lack of belief in religion. Third good thing is that most states have decriminalised abortion. There's still a couple of states that are a bit of a worry, which you can read in the report. The other good news, all states now have legalised voluntary assisted dying, although I believe the two territories, the Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory, even though legislation has now enabled them to make their own decision, from my memory, they are still to enact voluntary assisted dying legislation in the two territories. The last good thing is that we've got protections for freedom of expression and association, and we have a relatively strong free press. I've given the references there, page references to the key countries edition. So that's what's working well. What are the primary concerns in Australia? Still, we have no federal human rights charter. I know there are people working on that and lobbying that. It's been a long fight. Some public ceremonies, like opening of parliaments, local councils, the Anzac Day celebration, they are still Christian. Next, religious institutions, surprisingly, are exempt from tax and compliance requirements. Next, religious instruction in public schools, where it is done by unqualified religious volunteers. Next, the National School Chaplaincy Program is discriminatory. We'll say more about that later. Next, private religious schools receive most of the public funding, and many of these private religious schools are quite rich. So there's a real bias towards the rich private religious schools. Next, 3 states have recently targeted climate and non-violent protesters in some pretty draconian legislation. Next, some states still outlaw blasphemy. This is a real grey area still. We'll come to that. And lastly, the state religious vilification laws may restrict criticism of religion. This hasn't been tested in court, so still another grey area. So that's primary concerns. Okay, now I want to get to the actual report and read out some of the sections of the report to highlight more some things I've highlighted in the summary. You can download the report. I'll show you the link later. So in that first area of research, Constitution and Government, I've picked out this quote. Although the government is officially secular, it continues to favour Christianity for many public ceremonies. For example, each session of Parliament begins with a joint recitation of the Lord's Prayer. Same with the local and state, local councils and state parliaments as well. Various groups campaign against that practice and have had successes at local government level, giving some cause for optimism in the state of Victoria. I do know the latest figures I've seen. There was someone who did some research looking at local councils to see how many local councils are still starting council sessions with a religious prayer. It's now reduced to around about 50% of councils throughout Australia. No, I think that, I'm not sure whether that's Australia or Victoria. It might just be Victoria. It's now reduced to 50%. More and more councils now over the last few years have given up on a particular religious prayer and had no opening prayer at all, or had something that was more inclusive. Okay, the next part. Religious institutions in general also enjoy long-standing privileges in being exempt from paying tax and from complying with laws such as the Victorian Equal Opportunity Act against discrimination and the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission Act for Transparency and Government. That last bit about non-profits and charities not having to satisfy the more stringent requirements for governance, from memory, they don't have to submit an audited financial report, whereas if you're not a religion, not a charity, then you do. The other one about getting exemption from the Victorian Equal Opportunity Act, that's been a big issue here in Australia. There's been a lot of angst and a lot of complaints about the right of some religious schools. There was a recent case, religious school, private religious school, who sacked a teacher because she was cohabitating with her partner without being married. It didn't impact her skills as a teacher, but it went against what the legislation and the schools call the ethos of the organisation. Another example is you could be a gardener in one of these schools, and if you're not a Protestant, or if you're not a Catholic, or you're not a Muslim, whatever the ethos of that school is, then it looks like you could be sacked because you don't subscribe to the religion of the school. So they're the particular examples we're talking about there. Here's another quote from the report. In 2019, a religious discrimination bill was proposed that would prohibit discrimination in certain areas of public life on the grounds of religious belief or activity. Many groups, including anti-discrimination commissions throughout the country, opposed it. While the coalition government set out to develop a second version, that too was strongly opposed, and despite passing with the amendments in the lower house, was never brought to the Senate for debate before the 2022 election changed the government. Now, that was because they didn't want to bring it to the Senate because there was a huge kerfuffle over it from rights groups, from lawyers, about how flawed it was, and they didn't want a big debate, big divisive debate on this before they went to the election in 2022. So continuing the quote, the new Australian Labor Party, ALP, government has said it will prepare a revised bill that removes some of the contentious areas where state-based anti-discrimination laws were overridden. Now we're waiting to see whether that's actually going to happen. It might not happen in the first term of a new Labor government. Okay, I think that's it for that section. So I'm going to stop share and see if anybody has any questions or comments on that section on governance. Okay, Joe.
Yeah, is there actually any legislation that's even challenging the tax exempt status?
Not legislation. Now, I think this is at the federal level,
Proposals. Yeah.
but there's no proposed legislation. The secular humanist atheist groups have been talking about it and kicking up a bit of a fuss, but no political party, except maybe the Reason Party, might have flagged that they're happy to do some work on that. But unfortunately, the Federal Reason Party and the Victorian Reason Party um, have disbanded. Ruve.
Yes, I just wanted to ask if we have any, with the previous bill that you showed for discrimination based on religious beliefs, like, I'm just wondering, like, you're saying, is there an opposition against it? Like, I don't understand, like, how, like, what could be the push pull, the tug of war type argument against this bill?
There was massive opposition against it. Human rights groups, law groups were very much against it. It had some good points in the legislation. We all want to protect the rights of religious people to observe their religion as they see fit. But here's the real debating point, the point of contention. This bill went too far in that it wanted to protect the discriminatory practices of a religious person or institution. And the example, one example, well, this was a real live example. It looked like a religious school could sack a gay teacher or evict a gay student because it goes against the ethos of the school. Now, for normal companies, normal businesses, normal social groups, it's against the law to kick someone out of your group because they're gay or they're cohabitating or they're transgender. So our anti-discrimination legislation, we all want it to apply universally. But here was the carve-outs that were proposed in this bill, the carve-outs for religious institutions. If you're a religious institution, you get a free pass. You get to discriminate against gay, transgender, unmarried people just because you are religious. And that's where the big puffle were out. This is, example of what we call religious exceptionalism. They get exceptions in the law because they're religious, as if that was somehow special. So yeah, there was a big pushback against it, Rive.
So okay, so that's interesting. So their issue is that, things within the church should be, be handled by the church, so to speak. Like if a religious organization wants, like, a fence done around their buildings, they can discriminate on who they want to employ to do that based on religious reasons because it's on their property or something like that. But it doesn't apply. So okay. But what is the reason for, like, the initial allowance for that? Like why would they have that initial allowance to discriminate?
Well, the idea behind it is I'm a religious person. You're telling me I've got freedom to practice my religious beliefs, but now you're telling me when I don't want a Buddhist teacher teaching in my Christian school, you're now telling me there's limits on my religious freedom. You're either for religious freedom or you're not for religious freedom. You can't have it both ways. And I think I have the example of the Greens Party. The Greens Party is a minority party here in Australia. So it can be a difficult, a complicated legal issue because say you're running the Greens Party, a political party, and you want to employ a campaign manager or you want to employ a trainer to train people within your party. It seems that you ought to have the right, if the person is a trainer, say they're training them on Greens policy, that seems allowable. This is the kind of thing I would be arguing for. If the ethos, if the philosophy is a crucial part of the position, so headmaster, somebody's applying for a headmaster job in a Mormon school, Mormon private school, our intuitions tell us that you're a Mormon is a crucial aspect of being a Mormon a headmaster in a Mormon school. So I want to make a distinction, and that others have argued for it as well. If the religious belief is a core part of the role, the specific duties and responsibilities of that role, then yes. But if it's gardener or mathematics teacher in a religious school, then being religious or not religious or different religion won't impact your ability to be a maths teacher or a gardener. And this is the important bit. Being a maths teacher or a gardener, you're not teaching kids about their religion. You're teaching maths. It's got nothing to do. You're not teaching them religion at all. So there's some of the legal quandaries and legal complexities around this issue. And that's why the law groups and the human rights groups, why it's such a vexed issue to where do you draw the dividing line for what a religious school, for example, who they can employ and who they can't employ. All right, shall we move on to the next section? Okay, so that was Constitution and Government. Did I say that this section in Australia in the Key Countries Edition report only goes for 4 pages, so it's quite short. Okay, so the next section is Education and Children's Rights. So pulling out a couple of pertinent quotes from the report, the state governments permit religious education in public schools is generally taught by volunteers using approved curricula to varying degrees. Public schools in New South Wales, that's one of the states here in Australia, provide secular ethics classes as an alternative for students who do not attend religious instruction classes. Now, these religious instruction classes are taught by volunteers, usually from local churches, coming in to indoctrinate children for an hour. In other states, there is no secular alternative to religious education, but non-religious students may opt out of the class. Like, for example, here in Victoria, we got rid of sectarian religious instruction by these non-trained, non-professionally trained religious people. It used to be done in class time. That's now been booted out of class time, either lunchtime or after school. And before, when it was religious instruction during normal class time, it was an opt-out system. If you were a parent who didn't want your kid to go to the religious instruction class, you had to sign a form to say, my kid's not going to that class. Now it's an opt-in system. If you want your kid to go to one of these classes, you now have to sign a form to say you want your kid to go in. Now, the attendance rates, the figures I saw, was it in New South Wales? I can't remember. Attendance rates for these indoctrination classes went from something like, don't quote me, but some huge change, something like 80 or 70% down to, I think, less than 10%. It was a massive cut once your child had to be opted into the class and not opted out. I mean, it was really a no-brainer that if you want your kid to be indoctrinated by these untrained religious people coming in, it was no brainer for all of us that your right as a parent is that A, you're told what's going on, and B, your kid's not put in the indoctrination class unless you expressly give permission for your child to be in the indoctrination class. Okay, so the second part of the quote is both the Australian federal government and state and territory governments provide funding for private schools, the great majority which are faith-based. Catholic schools, and many Catholic schools are poor schools, are reported to receive up to 75% of their funding from government funds. Now, that's a high figure because a lot of Catholic schools are poor schools. But here is money from the education budget that we all pay into from our taxes, goes into specific religious schools, specific religious indoctrination. And how this continues, well, it's only because it's now been entrenched especially since 1975 when a new system came in. It's going to be really, really hard to change that one. So the other part on education and children's rights, in 2023, the federal government expanded its former National Schools Chaplaincy Program, which provided financial support for government and non-government school communities to conduct chaplaincy services in schools to school children. The current incarnation of the program, renamed the National Student Wellbeing Program, no longer requires chaplains to be religious. The program emphasises that wellbeing officers and chaplains must not proselytise and must, quote, respect, accept, and be sensitive to other views, values, and beliefs. Nevertheless, provision of chaplains is mostly managed through contracts with religiously dominated organisations who appear to prefer religious candidates. Now, let me make two comments on this. On the proselytising, it's now written into the project charter that the chaplains aren't allowed to proselytise, but we've got recordings of religious leaders saying how much they love this program. One of them that was describing schools as mission fields for these chaplains, allowing chaplains an opportunity to bring Christ to school children. So that's the one thing. The other one is, even though the letter of the law now is that these third-party providers are no longer allowed to discriminate by only allowing religious people to be chaplains. We won a VCAT, a local VCAT court case in that regard, but the third-party religious body that contracts these religious contractors to work in the schools, they've come out brazenly and blatantly said, oh, look, we're still going to only employ or contract people who are religious, deliberately flouting the VCAT decision. So we've still got a lot of work to do in that case. That hasn't been tested yet in court. This national school chaplaincy program going into the what's been committed in the next few years as well. I think all up it's an allocation of $6 billion, not 6 million, but $6 billion from the time it started a number of years ago to including the funding that's been committed for the next few years as well. $6 billion. Jennifer.
I can see to some degree when they say we're still going to hire religious people, it's just the fact that we don't want them, you know, trying to convert the children. But otherwise, they in turn would be discriminating against religious people, would they not? If they, you know, didn't have a balance of employing people that were religious or not religious. And you know, it's really none of their business what they believe.
Oh, absolutely. So that goes to the religious test. Well, similar to the religious test for public office. Many secular constitutions, a part of it says that there ought to be no religious test for holding public office. So your religion ought to be blind to the person who's interviewing you. That's the fundamental principle. But these religious organizations, these middle party organizations that do the contracting, they're not saying we'll employ anyone of any religion. They are saying very expressly, we will, if it's a Methodist organization, third party business doing the contracting, they're expressly saying we will only employ Methodists. Or if it's more generally a Protestant or a Catholic organization, we will only employ Catholics, or we will only employ Protestants. It's that brazen.
My other question would be, in terms of the funding that they're given, the Catholic schools or religious schools are given, does the government maybe not sort of earmark that this funding is specifically for this, but not for the religious teaching training of it? Or do they just get to spend the money carte blanche?
Well, there's two things. One is every school is legally committed to teaching the Australian curriculum. Now, from what I hear, that's loosely enforced, and there are schools that do a much better job teaching the Australian curriculum requirements than other schools. So some schools, for example, might sneak in a bit of creation science, for example. From what I know, there's no requirements to say what kind of buildings you have to build, or what kind of sports facilities, or what kind of sports programs you have to have, other than meeting the minimum requirements of the Australian curriculum. So, for example, there's so many hours you've got to do in sports education as part of the curriculum. But if you meet the minimum curriculum requirements, from what I know, there's no restrictions at all on what you can spend the money on. And this is the real obscenity. The richest private schools are literally putting in gymnasiums, private large swimming pools on their school grounds, whereas other schools, the parents are struggling to pay for the uniforms, and they have classrooms that are not air conditioned, for example. Let's move to the third section. Okay, so the third section is family, community, and society. So here's a bit that I pulled out. An analysis of the 2016 census data. Here in Australia, the Australian Bureau of Statistics runs a national census collecting a whole bundle of information on the population that's used by future governments every 4 years. Analysis of the 2016 census data and other academic surveys suggests that religious belief is on the decline in Australia, with 62% of the population reporting that they did not belong to a religious organisation. 71% of Australians indicated that religion was not personally important. Further, 80% of marriages are now conducted as civil ceremonies. And what I've got in the little box down there, I've just pulled out the 2021 census results on religious belief. With that, nearly 44% of Australians call themselves Christian, 10% say they're of another religion, and nearly 39% say they're of no religion or some kind of secular belief. Now that 39%, that is bigger than the Catholics and the Anglicans put together. So it's now quite a sizable political demographic, religious demographic. The other thing is, at the next census, we're hoping the question is going to change again, asking for people's religious belief, because all the way up until now, it's been assumptive. It's asked people in the census question, what religion are you? And then you have the option of saying what religion you are or no religion. That's assumptive, that's presumptive. And that we think that's one of the reasons why that figure of 43.9% is still far too high. So it looks like in the next census, the ABS, they ask for submissions, and they're warming to the idea of making the first question, are you religious? Yes or no? And then if yes, saying what religion you are. So if we can get that in for the next census, we're expecting quite an even more sizable drop in the number of people who are saying they are religious. But this is this rapid decline. It really is a rapid decline in religious belief. From the 1950s, when women started to enter the workforce, people were becoming much more educated. That's where we started to see this rapid decline, and it's going to continue in the modern liberal Western democracies. Okay, let's move on to the last section. So this dimension that the report looks at is freedom of expression and the promotion of advocacy of humanist values, it's called. So pulling out one pertinent quote, as in many parts of the world, the polarization and claims of discrimination or being silenced have increased on both sides of several topics. For instance, there was strong debate about the right of a high-profile sports person to publicly declare that, quote, homosexuals, among others, are bound for hell. That included the unmarried people having sex and unmarried mothers and atheists, of course. He included those. Thanks. That was Israel Folau, I think. The person's contract, this rugby player, I think he was at the time, was cancelled and a court case ensued. He took the sporting body to court where they claimed religious discrimination as the statement was part of their religious belief. The case was settled before trial, avoiding the setting of a legal precedent. And that was really the big shame, because we really needed some legal clarification on this in terms of organisations reining in the statements made by their employees and contractors that are not inclusive, the opposite of being inclusive, being exclusive. Because this star footballer or soccer player, I think he actually had some gay people on his team, or they certainly were on other teams that he was playing against, which is crazy. Okay, another quote. Consequently, the common law offences of blasphemy and blasphemous libel may yet exist in New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and the Northern Territory, and the common law offence of blasphemy in the Capital Territory. Code offences of blasphemy or blasphemous libel exist in Tasmania. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know the difference between common law offence and code offence. If somebody's a lawyer here or versed in law, maybe you could help us out there. But this is the worrying thing, because these cases haven't been tested in court. We really don't know the legal interpretation of these codes and laws that are still on the books. Lastly, the federal government and several states have passed laws outlawing racial vilification, and the states of Tasmania, Queensland, and Victoria have extended those laws to also outlaw religious vilification. There is a debate about the extent to which these laws, can't see that word, can prescribe incitement to hatred, or whether they may be used to suppress non-inciting speech about religious beliefs and practices. And this is really where this grey area is. How much do you need to criticise a religious person or a religious institution before it crosses over the line to being illegal? And this is where these things need tested in court. So you don't want it to be the case in a modern liberal secular democracy where you can't criticise a religious person or a religious institution, but at the same time you want to outlaw someone inciting someone to so much hatred that they're going to go and physically attack a religious person because they're religious, the incitement to violence. And there's that big grey area in between that still hasn't been tested. Before I go to the concluding remarks, just let me point you to the reading list. I think we're going to make this slide deck available as well. So when we do that, we'll share the URL. So on the reading list, the first reference is the ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics results for that area that includes the religion question. It's in the cultural diversity area. So that's the URL for that. The second one is where you can where you can access the entire Freedom of Thought report, the online edition for all of the countries, the preface, the introduction, the whole lot. The third reference is this key countries edition that I've been reading from tonight, excerpts from, and you can download it as a PDF. And the last one, I haven't mentioned the Secularism Australia conference we had on the 2nd of December here in Sydney, brought together all the big secular, humanist, atheist organisations in Australia to thrash through those separation of church and state issues that we've been highlighting, that have been highlighted in the Freedom of Thought report and that we've been talking about tonight. So they're the references. That's my bio and where you can contact me. A bit on Humanist Australia, if Humanist Australia is new to you. This one, the important one, how you can contact us. Website, humanistaustralia.org. Check us out on Facebook, facebook.com/Humanist Australia. On Meetup, meetup.com/Humanist_Australia. And by email, team.ha@humanistaustralia.org. I wanted to go back to the concluding remarks. So for those people who are watching the video, here are some questions to hopefully get you thinking more. So the first question I've got for you is, which of the report findings on Australia concern you the most? The second question to think about is, how did we get here? What was the historical trajectory that got us to being the modern, mostly secular, liberal democracy where people are by and large not discriminated against on their basis of their religion or not religion, but we still have some challenges. So how did we get to the point where we're at now? The third big question is, in terms of separation of church and state, discrimination against the non-religious, do you think over the last few years or last few decades, Australia is getting better at that or worse at that? And then the last question is, that's the so what question. What can we, and I'm including you, the viewer, the listener, do about the situation? Now, if you would like to get involved in these issues and help with Humanist Australia campaigns, please contact us with one of the portals that I showed you just before. So we hope to see you next time. Just keep an eye on the Meetup website, our Meetup page, to see what events are coming up next. Thank you.